All right, here goes my solution for the first part of the coding challenge that I just showed you. So I start with creating the John object. So the object literal again, then the full name, John Smith, and then an array of the builds, just as it says in the instructions. And the builds are 124, 48, 268, 180, and $42. Okay, and that's all the data that we need. Now we're already ready to write our calc tips function, or method, I should say. So function without any argument, such like before. And so this challenge here is actually a bit similar to the one before, where we calculated the BMIs for John and Mark. The only difference is that this time we also need some loops. And so that adds a new level of complexity to this function here. All right. So remember how I said that you should start with an empty array for both the tips and the final values. And while you could do that, you could do it like this. So tips, and then here an empty array. But I figured that it would be a bit cleaner to start without it here. And instead, as soon as we run the function, then we add these empty arrays to our object. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we just say this dot tips equals an empty array. And then also this dot final values is also an empty array. Okay, so I'm giving it the same names as I did in the other tip calculator. So tips will be the array with all of the 5 tips, so one for each of these builds, and then the final values is the array where we will have the sum of each tip with each bill. Okay, and so now we have to loop through the builds in order to calculate the tip for each of these values. Okay, and so of course we're going to use the for loop, such as we learned in the last lecture. For, and we're starting at I, 0, and we're going until I reaches the length of the bills array. So once more, it's the exact same thing as we did in the last lecture, okay? So we're just applying what we just learned before. So where is this builds? Well, it's at this dot bills and then dot length. And so here you see something for the first time, which is 2 dots, okay? And actually the dot is an operator. So let's go to our operator precedence table that is still opened here. And here you have this operator, which is called the member access. Okay, and we see that this one is executed from left to right. All right, and so this is why this works. So here is the first one, so the first dot. And so this dot builds is the first part that will be executed. And so this here will be basically replaced with this array. And so we end up having this array here. And then after that, we read then the length property, this one here, of that array. Okay, so if it was the other way around, if we started reading this way here, then it wouldn't work at all, because bills.length would be something unknown. So it wouldn't exist, because all that exists is this dot bills. And so of course, it makes a lot of sense that we start basically reading, that we start executing from left to right. So that was just a small detail, but I think it's important to really understand why these things actually work the way they do. Okay, I hope you agree with that. So I++. All right, makes sense? So again, we're going all the way until we reach the length of the builds array, which is 6 in this case. So we execute it for 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so the length is not 6, it's 5. I think I said 6, but of course it's 5. All right, so what are we going to do in each iteration? Well, just like before, we are going to determine the percentage based on the tipping rules. Okay, so let's write that down here. Okay, and so I like to add these comments here in order to figure out beforehand, before actually writing the code. So we determine the percentage, and then we add the result to the corresponding arrays. So this is the same stuff that we did before. So we defined the percentage without actually specifying it. So we just declare the variable here, but do not define it. And we do that based on the bill. So if the bill is less than 50, remember, So that's the rule that we have up here. So if the bill is less than 50, then the tip is 20%. It is 15% if it's between $50 and $200, and it's 10% if it's more than $200. All right, and so we are going to translate that here into code. Okay, and actually bill is not something that we have defined. So sorry for that. So it's not bill, but instead, what do we have here? We have this dot bills at the current position. Okay, so maybe this is starting to become a bit confusing. Okay, and I totally get that. And as I actually mentioned before, that was kind of the goal of this challenge, not to be confusing to you, but to make you think a little bit about how these things work. So how can we solve this kind of problems? Okay, so this dot builds is our array with the bills, right? And what we do here with the loop is to loop exactly through that array. And so it only makes sense that we then access the current position of this array using the current counter variable. Okay, and that's always I, just as we learned in the last lecture. All right, and so let's now define the percentage for this bill value, and that will be 0.2. Okay, so 20%. Then else, and let's actually grab this one here. So if it is larger or equal 50, and at the same time it should be less than 200, right? So that it stays exactly between 50 and 200. So in this case, the percentage is going to be 0.15. And then finally, in all other cases, the percentage is going to be 0.1. Okay, now as you see here, we have a lot of duplicate code here. So this this.builds and then at position I, we have repeated it here 3 times. And so let's actually create a separate variable for that. So let's call that one bill. Okay, and so before doing anything here, we simply create a variable where we store the current bill value. All right, and so we can now go ahead and replace all of these here. And so that's a bit better. So instead of repeating the same code multiple times, we just store the value in a variable. Okay, so that is much better. Okay, so for each of the bills, we have now figured out the percentage. So all we have to do now is to add it to the tips and to the final values array. So this dot tips at the current position, and remember that is I. Well, and now it's very simple. It's the bill variable that we defined before. So this dot bills at the current position times the percentage. And so this part here is exactly the same as in the more simple version of our tip calculator, right? And now finally, this dot final values at the current position will be the bill plus the this dot tips at the current position. Or actually we can do this one here, so it's the same. Okay, so we have the bill plus the bill times the percentage. All right, and so that's actually it. So that is our tips calculator, which will at the same time calculate the tips for all of the 5 bills. All right, so let's actually try that out. So john.calc tips, and then let's log it to the console. Console.log John. All right. Oh, we have some syntax error here at line 674. So where is that? And indeed, I'm missing the if here. So else if. Probably you already saw that one coming. So I'm sorry for that mistake. And so now we have the object here. And in here we have our builds, we have our final values, and we have our tips. So it's all here now. Okay. So we have 18.6. 9.6, 26.8, 27, and 8.4. And these, if we add it to this builds, will then result in this final values that we have here. So for example, this 180 plus the 27 is 207. And that's exactly what we see here, right? So it means that it's actually working. So the first part of the challenge is completed, I think. Let's take a look. So add the method then should include a loop. Add as an output, create these 2 arrays. Okay, so the first part is finished. Let's take a look at it again because it's quite a lot of code here, and this is by far the most complicated code that we have written up until this point in the course. So the hardest part probably to grasp is the fact that inside of this method here, this calc tips method, we have this loop that calculates all of the 5 tips all basically at the same time, or one after the other, but automatically. So that's exactly the reason why we used the loop, okay? And so we had to have these kind of confusing like this.bills.length, where we first read the bills array from the current object, and then from there we get the length, all right? And then here we get the current bill, so the current value, and from there, well, basically the same is then the rest is the same as we did in the other challenge, okay? Then another particularity was that we had to create these empty arrays here so that we can then fill them up. And maybe you thought that we could do it like this. So this.tips is equals this.final values is equals an empty array. So maybe you try to do it all in one line, but that is not going to work. So this here will not work, because what this is going to mean is that these two arrays will be the same. So in this case, if you did it like this, if you then added something to the tips array, so this one here, then you would automatically also add it to the final values, because they would be in fact the same array, all right? And don't worry if that sounds a bit confusing to you at this point, because later on, again, we will learn why it is that way. So what I want you to do now is, after this video, take a deep look again at this method here, and especially, of course, at this method here, try to figure out why everything works the way that it does here, and only move on if it really makes sense to you. Okay, so this was the first part of the solution. Now in the next video, I will then solve this second part. Okay, so I'm leaving that for a different video so that you can first go over this again and make sure that you understand 100% what's going on here.